I wanted to thank you all for being here today. My name's Elizabeth McMahon-Patenko. I'm a librarian here at UC Merced. And I'm so happy to be able to introduce Dr. Danielle Thompson, who's going to be giving our Library Faculty Author Series talk today. Today's talk is also co-sponsored by the Center for Africana Studies, who donated the books for the raffle. So thank you. And also, if you have not gotten a raffle ticket, we are raffling off 5 books. So please do make sure you get one before the raffle starts. The Library Faculty Author Series showcases the latest research and scholarship by UC Merced faculty members. And if you'd like to be featured in a future Faculty Author Series talk, please let me know. For today, Dr. Thompson is an associate professor of anthropology and heritage studies at UC Merced, who studies investment, trade, and migration in conflict and post-conflict settings. His work centers on borders, transnational relationships, and economic uncertainty. Dr. Thompson holds a PhD in anthropology from Emory University, an MA in geography, and a certificate in geospatial technology from the University of Miami. And his work has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the Wenner Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research, and the National Geographic Society. And we're so happy to have him here with us today. So let's give him a round of applause.
All right, thank you. And yeah, it's great to be talking about this this book here at UC Merced. So I've already given talks on it in various formats. So I've kind of had to reformat this for various lengths of time, including I was in the Horn of Africa last month in the end of July and early August, and got to do a couple of discussions and panels about the book in the city that it's about. So I'm happy to see you all here. Great to have some of you who have followed this project throughout its development, and some students as well, some undergrad students, to hear more outside of the classroom about what we do in research and what I've been working on over the past few years. So really, rather than just walk through the book and its arguments and that sort of thing, I want to take you on a journey and give you some look behind the scenes of how this book came to be, and then I'll talk a little bit about the key messages of the book. But I want to also just capture some of the process, which also is there in the book, of doing research in this area. So the area that I'm talking about today is in the Horn of Africa, specifically the eastern part of Ethiopia. In 1991, Ethiopia decentralized and divided into multiple ethnic regions in a system that's called multinational federalism, or ethnic federalism. So the eastern part of Ethiopia, which borders on Somalia, which has famously been a collapsed state since 1991, and Somaliland, which is a not internationally recognized but a functioning autonomous area. And so this eastern part of Ethiopia is Somali regional state, and it's been inhabited by ethnic Somalis. It also has been a war zone for a lot of the past 100 years. And so not a lot of research has been done in that area. There's been just a recurrent series of conflicts, and some of those tensions are still ongoing. There's a lot of uncertainty in this area. And so also we can talk a little bit about what it means to do business in the context of intense uncertainty. But first, I'll take you on a little bit of a journey. So let's start out at right here, this place called Tohojale on the border between the Republic of Somaliland and Ethiopia. And this Tohojale is a small town that's divided by this tog, or stream bed, that runs along the border. So here's a view of the border, and on the left side, you can see the market on the Somaliland side of the border. And in many ways, Tohojale is a fairly typical African border town. There are customs and immigration offices on both sides. Trucks kind of creep through the immigration or the customs and rumble across the border from Somaliland into Ethiopia. People come and go across the border. They basically just totally ignore that it exists. You can see even in the picture, people just walk across the dry stream bed back and forth. And people who are visibly from that area don't even bother to go to immigration, don't need to show any kind of documentation. And it's interesting, in fact, so various times over the past 10 years, I have gone without showing ID. I have been asked to show ID. I've been denied from going across the border, even with a valid visa. Most recently, last month, I was there, And I walked from Ethiopia into Somaliland, and the Somaliland authorities kind of pride themselves on being open and welcoming and having people like, people are allowed to cross the border. And not only did they not did they let me pass through, the immigration authority, the head of the border post there, adamantly refused to look at my passport. He was like, no, you're welcome here. I don't want to see your passport. Just go walk around and go back to Ethiopia whenever you're ready. So this is the kind of border on the Somaliland side. And Togo is mainly known for three things. So the first is that the Somaliland side of the border is a major hub of Ethiopia's currency black market. So over the past 20 to 30 years, Ethiopia has had, up until 2022 or 2023, Ethiopia had tight currency controls, and citizens of Ethiopia were barred from possessing US dollars, which is the international currency and the currency that you need to buy things, to import to Ethiopia. So importers who wanted to bring things into Ethiopia would either have to wait for 6 to 8 months to get a few $1,000s through the Ethiopian bank at the formal exchange rate, or they would go and pay a 30% premium to go buy the dollars on the black market. So they basically like pay the black market exchange rate, buy thousands of dollars there, put them in their bank account in Togo, then send them to China or Dubai or wherever they want to import things into Ethiopia from. So Togo is a major hub of this black market. The second thing that Togo is known for is it's a big export hub for chat or khat, which is a mild narcotic substance. It's grown in Ethiopia, so it's basically just a plant. It grows in the same areas as coffee. People pick the fresh leaves of the plant and chew them. It has it's kind of maybe like organic Adderall kind of thing. Like you just chew the plant fresh. It makes you very hyped up and very alert. People use it for studying, for paying attention to things. Makes some people a little bit of crazy, but it's an important export for Ethiopia, ranging from like 6% of Ethiopia's exports up to 11, 12% some years of Ethiopia's export revenue. You may know about Ethiopia. Ethiopia is famous for what international commodity? Coffee, right? So coffee makes up like 50% of Ethiopia's export revenues. Cod is up there with coffee, and especially if we include the fact that a lot of Ethiopia's cod goes out illegally. So there's a lot of black market kind of chat or cod export. And the main buyer of that cod is Somalia. So Ethiopia exports a ton of this narcotic substance to Somalia. The third thing that Togo is known for is its most visible trade. So especially at the time when I was doing the research, what was really noticeable is that every day if you go to Togo, you'll find thousands of Ethiopian women going there to buy shoes, clothes, cosmetics, shampoo, baby powdered milk, diapers, these sorts of things, just everyday consumer goods, because Ethiopia has these taxes that are like over 100% on most items. Somaliland has 0 taxes, so they go across the border, buy the things, come back and smuggle them into Ethiopia and sell them in the city of Jigjiga or somewhere else in Ethiopia for a profit. So this is kind of every day. If you would ride a minibus taxi or a bus out to Togo, you see these women going across the border, buying things, coming back to Ethiopia to sell them again. Now, once they cross back into Ethiopia, things start to get interesting, because between the border at Togo and the city of Jigjiga, which is the closest city to the Somaliland border, the capital of Somali regional state, you have to pass through a series of checkpoints. And the most notable of these, which remains there today, is called Magalo Karan, Town of the Nation. But a lot of the local traders at the time of the research referred to this checkpoint as Magalo Piamo, which means Judgment Day Town. Because as you're passing through this checkpoint, the security forces who are searching people there constantly accuse people of migrating illegally, smuggling things, which they are, a lot of them are smuggling things, or not being who they say they are, or just random accusations, and then they often put them away in jail and there's no kind of process of court being charged, anything like that. if they say, hey, you're violating something, you go to jail and people might not hear from you for 2 months, 3 months, 5 months, something like that. And so, this intensity of the search, also when you're passing through Magalokaran, they would pat you down. Like, I mean, it was in like very violating sort of pat down. And this is, so if we think about this border area, throughout a lot of its history, this Ethiopia-Somalia border area, inhabited by Somalis on both sides, a lot of people have family on both sides of the border. And only since 2014, it's become this incredibly tightly controlled border regime. And so the book narrates the story of this shift from kind of a more open border historically to this extreme intense border regulation. And through talking about the border, it also tells a story about these changing patterns of globalization and connection with the rest of the world. So we'll get to that, but after going through Magalokaran, so you came from Togojale, passed through the checkpoint Magalokaran, and you reach the city of Jigjiga. Jigjiga has been famous for a long time as the hotbed of Ethiopia's smuggling economy. But by the time I started this research in 2015, Jigjiga was starting to undergo a major transition. So it was the regional capital of Somali regional state. So on top of the kind of contraband black market economy, you also have regional politicians coming in. And the most surprising thing that I found out when I showed up in Jigjiga for the first time, so I was a PhD student, just finished my first year of coursework, went to Jigjiga, took a bus from Addis Ababa to Jigjiga. It's like a 12-hour bus ride. Didn't know anybody in Jigjiga. I showed up there, and the first people I met were a group of guys from the UK. And so I started talking to them in Somali, and this one guy turns to me, he's like, "Oh, brilliant! Where'd you learn Somali?" And I'm like, "Well, wait, like you're from the UK?" So in Jigjiga, also starting around the same time that this border security regime ramped up, 2013, 2014, 2015, thousands of Somalis from the diaspora, which is the global population of Somalis spread around the globe, started coming back to Jigjiga, Ethiopia, of all places. I mean, it's shocking because like nobody I knew had even heard of Jigjiga. And yet now you've got this kind of global space where you meet people from the US, Canada, Norway, UK. I met people who were like fluent in Chinese. They had been doing business in Guangzhou for years. So all kinds of people there, but all ethnic Somalis, right, who have lived abroad before. So when I started this project, I really thought of it as a project about the city of Jigjiga specifically. As Elizabeth mentioned, I had a background in urban studies. I'd spent a lot of time doing research on Somali and Ethiopian migration in Johannesburg, South Africa. But what I quickly came to see when I was spending time in Jigjiga is that I couldn't understand the city without also understanding how it related to the borders around it. And so this book reflects this long process that I've gone through of researching and thinking about the relationship between cities and borders. And I think in that regard, Jigjiga has something to tell us more about 21st century urban life, how border security regimes shape life in the cities. And that's especially the case in the Horn of Africa, but I think it's also the case much more broadly around the world. So we can back up a little bit and let's give some context of Jigjiga in the world. 2015, the first year that I was going to visit Jigjiga as a PhD student, having no clue what I was doing, just going there to see what the city was like, I reached Jigjiga in June of 2015, and this was the month that really the European refugee crisis, or the European migrant crisis, so-called, reached its peak. And so in 2015, 1.3 million people are estimated to have arrived in Europe claiming asylum. And this was the largest influx of asylum seekers to Europe since the end of World War II. A lot of media coverage and writing has focused on the European side of the equation, right? So a lot of the media that we see in the US looks at the European side of things, of like, oh, there's all these migrants coming on boats across the Mediterranean and that sort of thing. But in Jigjiga, I got a really fascinating perspective from an origin site. So a lot of the evenings that first month in 2015, we'd sit around TV screens and people were watching TV, watching the international news. So we were watching like CNN, watching the boats getting picked up out of the Mediterranean. But instead of thinking like, oh, where are all these people coming from or something like that, people are looking for their friends and family members who are on those boats headed to Europe, right? So we're there. People are always expecting to kind of see someone that they know on one of these boats. And, think about this. So we're sitting there watching for people who are fleeing from Jigjiga to go to Europe at the same time as we have all these people coming from, all these Somalis coming from Europe and North America and other places in the world back to Jigjiga. So you've got like this circular migration going on of like people trying to go abroad to become refugees. So they're seeking asylum abroad. And then all these former asylum seekers and refugees coming back to the same area where people are still fleeing from. I mean, it's a strange thing, right? Because we tend to think of migration as like, if you escape from that area, you never want to go back. And especially Ethiopia had such a terrible reputation among Somalis because of its long history of violent governance. Like once people ran away, the assumption was, why would they ever go back to Ethiopia? And so, yeah, I mean, there's this, when we think about this, again, there's this huge population of Somalis who have been refugees from 1991 onwards. If you're interested, you can go back to some of the backstory. A lot of the Somali refugees actually originated in Ethiopia, fled to Somalia in 1977, then fled again. So there's a lot of people who I know who have been refugees twice in their lives, or their parents were refugees and then they were refugees again. Somalis had fled from Ethiopia in the 70s and 80s, and then again been displaced from Somalia in the 1990s. And so the first set of questions that I started to ask as I went about research was, what is bringing all these people back to Jigjiga, right? Why are all these people coming? And in the book, I show how this is tied into Ethiopia's border regime. So just also a little bit of background about Ethiopia. If you know anything about Ethiopia, you might kind of be aware of a couple of contradictions, right? So I mentioned there's this sort of repressive government jailing people without trial. Also, they were at this time jailing anybody who was a political dissident. So there's no opposition parties in Ethiopia. If you post something on Facebook that says, hey, the government did something terrible today, then you could go to jail on charges of terrorism. And some people were disappearing and not showing up again. And some people were being killed for just simple opposition to the regime. And Ethiopia is a key ally of the US, right? So if you think about the Horn of Africa and kind of the war on terror, so post-2001 world, the US is the main one supplying not only weapons, but also logistics, signals intelligence, these sorts of things to Ethiopia, and specifically to this area of Eastern Ethiopia on the border that's been this war zone for so long. This what's called the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, EPRDF government, had been the government in Ethiopia from 1991. It was very repressive, and at the same time this kind of ally of the U.S. And again, they are the ones who had created the system where Ethiopia is divided up into these ethnic states. Somali region is one of those states. So this irony of like Somalis get their own state, but yet the government's still kind of repressing them, right? So how does that work? And so that brings up a key figure in the story who probably deserves more international recognition for the terrible things that he has done, but he's very, very well known among Somalis globally. So like if you talk to Somalis anywhere in the world, chances are they'll know who somebody named Abdi Mohammed Umar is. He's nicknamed Abdi Ile, and that's kind of how he's known among Somalis. And a little story from 2016 kind of highlights this contradiction even more. So in June 2016, Abdi Ile, the president of Ethiopia's Somali region, flew to Australia. And he's supposed to go to Australia to meet with some dignitaries there and to kind of attract the Somali diaspora from Australia to come back to Ethiopia and do business, telling them like, hey, it's peaceful in Ethiopia now, you can come back. But a bunch of Somalis who are living in Australia don't like him being there. He's a dictator, so they go out and protest in the streets. The supporters of Abdi and the people who are with him film the protesters, whoever is these guys in Australia. When they go back to Ethiopia, they round up those people's families, put them in jail, call them in Australia and say, hey, if you want your family to go free, you can post an apology video to YouTube telling us how great we are and how you were so wrong to go and be involved in the protest. And people did. So these apology videos are still out there. Human Rights Watch documented this, and I also have collected testimonies on this sort of practice. This is like another aspect of, you know, when I meet people from the UK or from the US in Jigjiga, some of them are there because the government has threatened their family members and told them, hey, like, you better come back and be here or we'll arrest your mom. Some of them are there because they see business opportunity there. And some of them are there because they're just kind of going to visit family. They haven't been able to go for 40 years. And so they're interested to go back to the area that they're from. So yeah, this is the kind of complex site of anthropological fieldwork in the Horn of Africa. So to add one more layer to that, I went in 2015 for a month. I went in 2016 for a month, kind of exploring the research, doing a little pilot study. In 2017, I went back to Ethiopia and showed up in Jigjiga with my wife. We planned to stay for a year because that's kind of typical anthropological fieldwork. You go stay somewhere for a year, you really get down into society, especially in a context like this. It's going to take time to build trust with people, to be able to interview them, these sorts of things. So we show up in Jigjiga. A month and a half later, there's this massacre in a town close by. People blame the massacre on the EPRDF government of Ethiopia and go out and block all the roads in eastern Ethiopia. So as I'm doing my field work for my doctoral dissertation, the government of Ethiopia is collapsing. All right, and literally, like, the prime minister stepped down for the first time in Ethiopian history halfway through the fieldwork. So there's this massive political crisis going on at the time. And so Abiy Ahmed, the current prime minister of Ethiopia, came to power in April 2018. Abdi Ile, the president of Somali region, was arrested in so I left Jigjiga. The timing was like, I was there in 2017. I stayed until July 2018. I left, the day that I left, Human Rights Watch published a massive report on all the extrajudicial killings that were going on in the region and on the jail. And then a month later, the regional president got arrested. So it seems like I got out of town at a good time, because I was already sort of being watched for the research that I was doing, as you can imagine. But also, it was kind of an opportunity that the government was collapsing while I was there, because the regional security officials were more concerned about what was going on at the federal level than they were about this foreign PhD student running around asking people questions. So it worked out for the research in that way. And it worked out because a lot of people who were involved in this project, obviously I couldn't have done this without a ton of local support on the ground. But people would tell me, hey, you can't publish anything about this until this government collapses. And they were like, it's going to collapse soon, but don't publish anything because we're going to be arrested because we've been seen around town with you. So a little bit of that's a long introduction to how this project came about and some of the context. So I'll talk for just a few minutes and then happy to answer questions about it. But I want to talk about the challenges of doing research in that environment and expand on that a little bit more. The conceptual puzzle that this book deals with. So what kind of are the key ideas and what is it trying to communicate? Talking about the cast of characters. So the book is obviously called Smugglers, Speculators in the City. So let's talk about who are the smugglers, who are the speculators, and how do they fit together in the kind of city and the urban environment. So the first of there were two really big challenges that I faced in carrying out this project. the first one I think is pretty obvious in the sense that like, how do you go and do research when people are being put in jail for saying stuff? Right? I mean, it's a huge challenge. People publicly would talk about, if so, one challenge I faced was like if I went and asked somebody to do an interview, their idea of an interview was having a TV camera shoved in their face by the state-controlled media and ask, how great of a job is the government doing? And they would have to say like, oh, they're terrific, like they're totally changed our lives, right? And they have to smile and whatever, and like whatever the reality was, they had to kind of present this front. So how do I, as a foreign researcher, go in and talk to people and do interviews in that environment? And I found that actually people were really wanting to talk about it. They really wanted to talk about the depths of what was going on, but they only wanted to talk about it in private, in a secure location, one-on-one, like nobody else in the room, mostly. So so I had to be very kind of secure and secretive with doing interviews, and also like anonymity, right? Like people were willing to have their voices recorded, but I also like what I told them is, so every night I would upload all the voice recordings to the cloud in like a secret encrypted folder and wipe the voice recorder clean. So I'd have to explain to people how I was doing that and how I was going to protect them on that. The challenge after the fact was this: how to think about and write about this period. I mean, I've just been talking about a lot about the violence and the political problems and stuff. And really, like, that is the narrative that has been told about this part of the world. And that's what people know about the Somali Horn of Africa. They know state collapse, they know failed governments, they know conflict, they know, militia groups, vigilante justice, all these sorts of things. But I didn't want to write a book that repeated those kind of Human Rights Watch narratives. Those are important, right? But I wanted to do something different, and something especially that captured the creativity and hope that people had in their kind of everyday lives, even amidst this intense violence. And so this was a challenge that I faced, is like, how do you kind of write about that and not spend all your time talking about how terrible things are, but also like people are doing really cool things, and people are very resilient and have like good friendships and relationships and like amazing families, and they're doing cool business and stuff like that. So that was a big challenge. And I also like in dealing with these things, I also wanted to make sure my position in the research was clear. And what was interesting about doing research at the border crossings is like, when I write about border crossings, I have to write about it from my perspective, because it's such a visceral experience of like being patted down and like touched in terrible places by people who you don't know, who are just trying to like scare you, and that sort of thing. And like, I know everybody else is going through that, but like everybody has their own individual experience of doing that, right? So like, I had to also make sure that I was a character in this text to talk about my kind of position, and so I'm not just like a mind of the researcher floating above the context of what's happening to everybody else. So yeah, I mean, the book really tries to capture obviously a complex set of things going on, but also this dynamism and this kind of combination that people had of like heartbreak, major losses, and like they had hopes and aspirations and dreams. And they were really heavily marginalized, right? But they were also really creative. And so how do we kind of hold those things together? And yeah, so to do that, what I really focus on in the book is I talk about the political context and really try to bring it to life. But I also focus a lot on people's everyday experiences, and especially their transactions. So how are they doing business with like government officials, right? How are they doing business across borders? How are they doing business in all these different ways? How are they trading things, exchanging things, sharing things, refusing to share things, all this sort of stuff in this context. And so that leads me to the conceptual puzzle. So the conceptual puzzle is this, right? As I observed, like Jigjiga's growth was clearly tied to this shift in border security. But I wanted to understand, like, how are the city and the border connected? And so in order to do that, I have to follow people who are working in the city, going across the border, follow the things that they're trading, kind of follow the buses as they're moving across these spaces. So how are these places connected? And so that leads to two specific questions. One, who's engaged in like making the border work, right? So I'm interested in what might be called bottom-up bordering. And the point here is like, we think of borders, and often the narrative that we have is like the officials, the government is the one who makes the border work. I'm like, yeah, the governments play a role in making the border work, but like people also make the border work, right? If people are like, they rat each other out for crossing the border, they're doing the work that the government would have them do of, preventing people from crossing the border. If people refuse to comply and they just cross the border as they want, or they kind of engage in smuggling and that sort of thing, they're also making the border work in a certain way. They're making the border more porous, right? Or more kind of easily crossed and accessible. So I think we have to see borders in terms of like the work that the government is doing, but also the work that everyday people are doing to kind of contest or uphold these borders. And then the second question brings that back to the city. So I asked, how do these border regimes affect life in the city? And also, how does the city affect the border regime? Like, if we see people as the ones who are creating these borders and upholding them and maintaining them, or like pushing against them, a lot of people live in the city, right? So what are they doing that actually makes the border work or not? Like, how are they doing that in the context of the city? And so I'll talk a little bit about some of the ways I found out that this was working. But just to think about these things, a lot of research has been done that kind of focuses either on the border itself or on cities. And what I was really trying to do is to do research in what I call a transversal way. So transversal meaning like looking at the processes across the border and the city. So looking not just as kind of one side or the other, but like, how do we understand the people and the things that are flowing across these spaces, and connecting them in various ways. And so this involves not just doing research like looking at the city, but I spent a ton of time riding minibus taxis around Eastern Ethiopia, going through all these checkpoints, following people, traveling with a variety of people, from the little small-scale contraband smugglers to government officials. I went with university delegations. I went with like diaspora attorneys who were pretty well off. A huge variety of people going to smuggle money to trade it on the black market currency thing, people smuggling khat or chat, the narcotic plant. And so trying to follow these processes through a variety of people. So yeah, if we think about the smugglers in the book, as I mentioned, a lot of these people are, especially at this time of research, it's changed a little bit now, and I can get into that if we need to in the Q&A. But a lot of these people, and indeed a lot of border traders, small-scale border traders around Africa, are women. So I would estimate, based on tallies and bus rides and minibus rides that I went on, about 70% of people on any given bus ride in the border area at the time I was doing this research would be women, mostly going to the border to trade small-scale contraband, right? And so people would even tell me, like, they call it contraband, and they like to call it contraband. If you ask people like, hey, what do you do for business? Be like, oh yeah, I'm a contraband smuggler, right? Which you think is kind of surprising, because you might think they would try to hide that. But there was like a certain pride for Somalis in being a contraband smuggler. And people would always even tell me like, oh, my dad was like the biggest contraband trader in Jijiga back in the 60s. And he'd tell stories about all the things that he had smuggled. I mean, people really, this is kind of part of Somali identity in Ethiopia. And people, what I found was people take such pride in this kind of cross-border smuggling economy, because like we're resisting the top-down Ethiopian government, right? That's trying to oppress us. Like, this is part of what it is to be Somali. Is we can't really fight them in other ways, but hey, we can dodge taxes, right? And we can avoid these things, and we can do business. And those Ethiopians from that part of Ethiopia, they don't know how to do business. We Somalis know how to do business. we don't care about taxes. People would say, like, I have a quote in the book that's just great about this guy bragging about his dad being a contraband smuggler. He's like, Somalis don't believe in tax, right? I mean, such a generalizing statement, but it actually does capture a lot of the things that I heard from people. Like, it's part of, identity to be this kind of economic dimension of identity, which is interesting too, because we think a lot in the US about identity in terms of politics, right? In terms of political minorities or these and I think it's thought about that way a lot, but there are these economic dimensions to identity that are really important to think about, especially in this context. And I think it's a more useful way to add that to the discussion than to just think about Ethiopia's minority groups in terms of political identity and representation and these sorts of things. So yeah, we've got the smugglers, and we also have not just the small scale smugglers, but some larger scale smugglers. So people are involved in all kinds of things. There's a blurry line between formal trade and smuggling, right? I mean, sometimes the people who have the connections with the top officials, they have the license and whatever, but actually they're not paying the taxes, right? So they may be smuggling things too, or they may be sending extra things along with what they have a license to import. So when we think about the smugglers, again, this is the kind of scene that you would see. This is the height of the sort of contraband check in June of 2017. Coming in from Somaliland into Ethiopia at Magalo Karam, you would just the minibuses would line up. We'd be coming down the road, and you just see off in the distance this long line of cars, and you pull up at the end, and the security officials would come and basically pull everything out of the car, throw it on the ground, search through it. Sometimes they would even pull the dashboards off of cars. They would rip the plastic pieces off doors, looking for any place where people could be smuggling things. A lot of it's just for a show, right? They want people to know, hey, you're being watched, this sort of thing. Yeah, so then turning to the speculators. The speculation is people who are trying to make a fast profit, right? In a context that they know is risky, either because the profit is not really guaranteed, or because they're doing something maybe that's shady. And so, you're facing fluctuations in currency markets or whatever, and you speculate on, hey, I'm going to make this investment and try to make a killing really fast. And the way that I came up with this concept is not I kind of grapple with this because it's not the best word, maybe people don't necessarily know what it means, especially when I take this back to a local audience. They're like, speculators, what? But then I say, oh, malantajir, and malantajir means millionaire in a day. And people are like, we know what that means. People are very familiar with these figures who come in and get government contracts to provide things at tax reductions or to build buildings or these sorts of things, and they make money very quickly. So people will come in, and so you have these kind of small scale contraband traders who are doing this work for maybe $5 or $8 a day, and you've got these people who get the licenses or contracts from the government who are making $5,000 per day. So big gap between your capacity if you're the small scale smuggler or the person who gets the import-export license, who then has the permission to bring things across the border. Because think about it, they close the border so that all the trade has to be either this little bit of smuggling or the license. They give the licenses to a few people. They would do things like, hey, I hear you talking shit about us abroad. Do you want to come back and I'll give you a license to import things to Ethiopia? And people would shut up, stop protesting, come back to Ethiopia and take their license and make a lot of money doing it. And so this kind of strategic, buying people off for political support was really common. And so this is the way they're using borders to bring people and attract people back. And so, not everybody, not all of the diaspora Somalis who came back from abroad to Jigjiga at this time had these connections, but a lot of them either had it or were looking for it. So you would meet people who were would tell you all the terrible things that the government was doing. And they're like, oh yeah, but I have a contract to do this, right? Or I'm looking for a contract to do that. So they're like talking about how terrible the government is, and they're trying to work with the government to bring things into the country or this sort of thing. So this is the perception. There's this vast money that's usually made through this alliance with this unstable authoritarian government. And yeah, it's interesting too, because now, like, so I go back to Jigjiga every year. And most of these people who are involved in this side of the business are gone. Like, obviously, they made money through they made this like millions of dollars through these alliances with the authoritarian government. They don't want to stick around now. Some of them are still there, and it's interesting to follow up on like the question of why some of them have actually made it even after relying on the government so heavily to make their money. So and we could add to this cast of characters. The book talks about government officials, and what's really interesting is like we kind of think of society of like the government officials and kind of society as often like different or separate or whatever. But like I would talk to government officials, like one of the people who are in charge of like trade licensing in Jigjiga, their mom might be like selling contraband on the street corner, right? And so they're like supposed to be cracking down on all the contraband, but like their family members are involved in it. They've got other cousins who are like really wealthy doing business. And so the social connections in Jigjiga kind of cross-cut these different things, these different aspects of trade. And so spending time with a lot of these people, I mean, I'm a cultural anthropologist and I embrace that identity. And I was really interested in the sort of cultural values, because even if you think about it, like the way people were talking about speculation, the word malantagier, it was an insult. So people had this sensibility of like, oh, these people are doing business, like making tons of money, it's illegitimate. So the way they talked about even the government, people allied with the government, was really negative. And so you can see in Somali culture this sort of anthropologists have classically called it like egalitarian. I don't think it quite captures it because it's not the desire of like everybody being materially equal, but it is maybe non-hegemonic, meaning that there's a culture of like not respecting central authority, of kind of respecting other people who break the rules. As examples of this, right? So an example is bragging about smuggling. Another guy was telling me how this guy I know in Jigjiga used to smuggle asylum seekers. Like if they failed to get asylum in one country of Europe, he would take them to a different country of Europe. And obviously, like that super shady business, he would brag to everybody in Jigjiga about how he'd done it. He made like $350,000 doing it, but he had it all in cash and he couldn't put it in his bank account. So he stored it all on the roof of his house. And one day the police showed up and took all of the money, right? So they brought dogs, took all the money. And he like brags about how he made 350K and lost 350K in a single day. So this is sort of the non-hegemonic ethos that I'm talking about, like people having this kind of, sense of humor about creative ways of making money. Losing money is okay too. People also they tend to share. So there's like this expectation that you share with people around you. If you have money, people show up knocking on your door asking you for money. And it's just a regular thing. Like, so even living in Jigjiga, I lived in a house that was owned by somebody in the US. Their relatives would always come knock on the door and I'd be like, hey, sorry, he's not here. And they're like, that's all right. Can you lend me $20? And I'm like, call them like, hey, is this one of your cousins actually? Like, do I need to give them the money? And so the whole town kind of operates like that, right? Where people are moving around the city trying to make these connections with other people, ask them for money and that sort of thing. And what the book goes into is actually, so if we look at the relationship between the city and the borders, the way that a lot of the border was working was there were all these people who had access to the border regime, to the government, who were in the city of Jigjiga, right? So you've got like the regional president, the head of security, like these sorts of people. And then you've got people who are looking for those people in Jigjiga to try to find them to get a license or just to move things. So I give this example of this guy was trying to smuggle sugar into the highlands of Ethiopia. So he had it in the Somalia region, he's trying to smuggle it into the highlands. The truck gets impounded at a checkpoint in Ethiopia. What does the guy do? He doesn't leave Jigjiga and go to the checkpoint. He goes around Jigjiga until he finds the right people who know him who owe him something, who can have some connection to get the truck released from the checkpoint. So people are managing the borders without ever leaving the city, just through their relationships with other people, right? And trying to use the city to build these relationships that let them move things around. And you can see that all the time. So what happens is the people who have the power would move around the city and try not to let other people find them, right? And because they know if people find them, then like if their cousin finds them, they're gonna have to give them something, right? So they would like go and people would just disappear from their own houses and they would be chewing chat. And so the book talks quite a bit about chewing chat because it's like something that the men always do together in the afternoon. We'd be chewing chat in some like hidden place, random place in the city, and only 3 people know where they are because they know if word gets out, then half the city shows up to where they are to ask them for some kind of favor or something like that. So the book really talks about that. And if we think about that, people trying to make the border are also creating spaces in the city, right? So by trying to avoid other people who want to get the licenses or contracts or these sorts of things, they're also like creating business in the city for these little private places where they can go and hide and hang out outside of their houses. So there's this whole kind of process of like people trying to move things across the border and bringing contraband and these sorts of things, the security regime and all these places interacting in these spaces in the city. So that really brings us like to the main point. And I think if we expand beyond Jigjiga, you know, this is the story about Jigjiga, but I think it should push us to think more broadly about cities and borders in the 21st century world. I mean, we can take the US-Mexico border as an example, and it's a classic border that's been written a lot about in border studies. And a lot of people talk about what's going on at the border, right? But like the border is also being made by security companies, right? In their headquarters, in major cities around the US, obviously by politicians in DC and the people who are taking contracts to provide, you know, infrared sensors and security technologies and cameras and all these sorts of things. Lobby groups, all these people are interacting often in an urban environment that's far away from the border. And in doing so, they're also making the border work in certain ways, right? And this also goes for people, I think, those of us who are everyday people who are like either resisting or confronting or going along with things that are going on with this current like global tightening of border regimes and border securitization. Like the border doesn't just exist there at the border. I think Jigjiga tells us this, that the border also, we have to view it as this sort of transversal thing that stretches into space, into our daily lives. And so that should, I hope, kind of shift our thinking about the relationship between cities and borders. I know I'm at the end of my time and I want to get into Q&A, but I will just mention a couple things that happened. So as I mentioned, I got out of Jigjiga in 2018. I didn't tell anybody that I was leaving until I was actually almost on the plane to the US because I was pretty terrified of getting like that they would just suspect that I was doing something. And, you know, I didn't want all of the information that I'd collected, especially to be revealed. But since 2018, Ethiopia has changed a lot. So as I mentioned, in August of 2018, Abdi, the regional president of Somali region, was arrested. And it was said that he was charged with inciting ethnic violence. He's actually been released from jail as of last year. So it's not clear that he actually was officially charged with anything. And it may be that he's still a political pawn, like being used by the central government. But a new regional president is there in place. And he also, this new regional president who's been in place since 2018, he came back from abroad as well. So he used to be an opposition figure. But Somali region and Ethiopia in general are still undergoing a lot of political changes. It's a really fascinating place. Again, I continue to go back there every year, doing some research in Somali region still. And yeah, just finally, I want to thank everybody, especially here at UC Merced, a few specific folks, the UC Merced Center for the Humanities, Christine Alexis here. You've been watching this project since very early stages. UCHRI at the president's level, as at the general UC level, also supported this project. And I just have a lot of people to thank. No book ever gets written that's like, my name goes on the front cover, but there's like so many people that I can't even name them who participated in big or small ways in making this this project happen. So thanks, and look forward to questions. Yeah, I think.
Well, thank you, Daniel. This is fascinating, and it's a lot of information. It's kind of overwhelming to digest. I have a comment and then I have a question. The comment is, when you were talking about this sort of circular immigration or migration, from Ethiopia to Europe and then back, and then going again, sort of like that. That reminds me of Hong Kong. When China was taking over Hong Kong in 1997, a lot of people went to Canada, the US and UK and Europe. And then after 1997, a lot of them actually returned because of the boom of the economy.
Yeah.
And they saw lots of opportunities. And then about 2014, 2015, when the umbrella movement happened, they left again. They went to Canada. A lot of them went to UK. So it's also kind of like a circle. And I'm sure it's happening in other parts of the world as well. So it's interesting to see all that. So my question is, you said you're going back every year, and even though you said when you were leaving, got on the airplane, you were concerned about what you did in terms of research to be, in trouble. My general question is, are you concerned about your safety? And particularly when you have your family going with you, are you concerned about their safety?
Yeah, so I'm not. The region has been really safe since 2018, 2019. So the government was the main one who was causing people problems before that time. Since then, it's the new government that came in has let off. And in fact, they really love to criticize the previous government. So anything I say that criticizes the government at the time that I'm working, they're like, yeah, those guys were so terrible. And I'm like, and literally we have these conversations with other people who I work with, and they're like, that guy was part of the previous government too. And yet he'll be up there being like, oh, those guys were so terrible. They did awful things to us. So, I mean, so it feels safe, but it also does feel still unstable. And it's interesting to like be in this position of having Abdile released from prison. And if he's a pawn in Ethiopia's political game, if he or anybody associated with him came back to power in Somali region as kind of pawns of the central government, like then the landscape would suddenly totally shift and I would not be safe to go back there. So yeah, for right now, I do feel like fine. And in fact, I have 3 young kids, all under 6 years old, and they came with me last year to Jigjiga and stayed there for a few weeks. We have a lot of friends who are, when I was doing my PhD in Atlanta, I know a lot of Somalis in Atlanta, and a lot of the Somalis in Atlanta are from Ethiopia originally. So we have a good friend community there who know us in Atlanta, but who now live in Jigjiga and have gone back. So I kind of keep tabs on what's going on day to day. But yeah, these days it's like, especially for a foreign researcher, it feels really safe. For people who are well connected, it feels really safe. There are some rumblings about police violence and stuff like that still.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, a lot of like the action you described seems driven by the fact that the Ethiopian government in 2015 cared a lot about what people in the diaspora were saying. Can you talk about a little bit about why they cared? Because like things would have transpired very differently if they had not had such this like bring people back or shut people up or do things like that. So I'm just curious, like, if you have any sense of their motivation.
Yeah, okay, that's a really good question. And actually, I think it needs more research on that topic and on Ethiopia as a whole. Because so what's interesting is I think Somali region is fairly unique in that way. So one, but if we step back to Ethiopia as a whole, the Ethiopian diaspora is huge, right? So in the US, Ethiopians are the second largest African migrant population in the US. There's like 200,000 something Amharic speakers, which is the main language in Ethiopia in the US. And they play a big role, and especially around this time. So in 2017 to 2018, there were big groups based out of Minnesota that were pushing the US government to enact legislation that like condemned Ethiopia's human rights abuses and these sorts of things. So the Ethiopian government had its eyes on those people, and it did have its supporters here in the US trying to kind of clamp down on that. Most of those non-Somali Ethiopians, a lot of them were not going back and investing in Ethiopia at this point. There were a few, but it wasn't a big trend. Also, in that part of the country, the predominant highland Ethiopia, the culture is very different. And so I'm not aware of this strategy of threatening family members in Ethiopia to get things from the diaspora or to force them to do things. But it may have happened. But I know in Somali region, my impression is that part of it is that because Somalis have these such dense family relationships, and they really, I mean, so Somalis are famous globally for like the amount of money that they remit to family members. There's these really intense transnational support networks, and so people have these obligations to maintain connections and to support friends and family there, and that's what was really being weaponized to like force people to do things. But I think since that time, there's been growing awareness of sort of the importance of the Ethiopian diaspora and politics. And it's especially come about, I mean, you think about the conjuncture and the other things that are not mentioned in this talk, like WhatsApp, right? Social media. All of these things have transformed the landscape where like somebody can direct road closures in Ethiopia from an office in Minnesota. So you think about like this kind of border work that goes on in the cities, like and the book talks about this some, like what people are doing in Minneapolis or in Washington, D.C., like the Ethiopian community in D.C. is also affecting border security in the Horn of Africa. So we have to think about these kind of international relationships. So I don't know if that can neatly answer your question. So yeah.
So I moved here from Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
I was associate professor at St. Cloud State University. And thank you for this presentation because this explains so much of what I saw among my Somali students and my Somali neighbors. They have to be the most entrepreneurial people on the planet. I mean, they get here and within 3 months, they're running their own little store, they're running a grocery, they're running coffee shops, restaurants. I mean, they just sort of integrated themselves into the landscape. Which is something I've not seen in other groups. And I'm agog, and it's, quite frankly, it's something to admire. And I don't know if you've been in Minneapolis, but they have the great big huge Somali mall.
Mm-hmm.
So they took over a dead mall and just turned it into this thriving, bustling hub of economy in Minnesota. So my question, sort of, you keep saying, running things from Minneapolis. That has been a source of contention in the state because, if anything bad happens in Somalia and it was, and the activity originated in Minneapolis, it just gets all of the nativists up in arms. Oh my God, Somalis are coming over here and they're being terrorists. Even if the terror isn't happening here. What's done to fight that, or is any effort being made to sort of change attitudes?
Attitudes around
Somalis, around migration, around just this invisible cord that stretches between Minnesota and Somaliland.
Yeah. I mean, no, it's a great question. So to answer your questions, I have not spent a lot of time in Minneapolis, but I have gone several times. I was there most recently in May and just had like several days of meetings with Somali and Oromo community, which is another minority group in Ethiopia. And yeah, Minneapolis is a really fascinating place for any of you who have been there. The Somali malls, right? There's multiple Somali malls, often that are built by people from different regions of the Horn of Africa. So you've got like your mall that's built by people from southern Somalia, Mogadishu area. You got like, there actually is a Jigjiga business center in Minneapolis by people who are obviously from the Jigjiga area. 24 Mall is by people from Kabul Dahar. Like, so these malls are known to be like representative of different people from different areas. They also like, often the Somali economy in Minneapolis tends to be very inward facing. So like they have these malls where all the customers are Somali, right? So they're very entrepreneurial. There's this high entrepreneurship, but it's also sort of like from within their own community, a lot of the entrepreneurship takes place. So like I was in this mall, one of the big malls in Minneapolis, and I was just walking through the mall and like I hear, people don't know that I talk Somali, especially when I show up in Somali. So they're talking behind my back and I'm like, they're telling about how this is, oh, the building inspector's here or whatever. Like, and I'm like, yeah, I mean, so that just like tells you that there's a lot of kind of inward facing entrepreneurship. And I mean, it's both ways, but yeah, I don't think that there's been enough on, and I think there needs to be more on the sort of positive contributions that these networks, transnational networks make, because I think you're right. Like when something bad happens and you hear, oh, this guy went back from Minneapolis and participated in Al-Shabaab in Somalia or something like that, like it makes all these international headlines. But like when somebody from Minneapolis opens a hospital in Jigjiga or something like that, like nobody really cares, right? And so it's one, I think there's this general phenomenon of bad things always being newsworthy. And there's an important question of like, how do we really highlight and shift people's attention and awareness to the good things that are going on? Like, for example, the chief of like one of the big regions in Ethiopia, like the local, Somali leader who's kind of the royal person in that area, like he's a Verizon network technician from Ohio. Right. I mean, so he's lived his life in the US. Now he goes back and he's doing good things. There's a lot of people like that who are doing good things for communities in Somalia and in Ethiopia, but it's not really well known or publicized outside of the Somali community. So hopefully scholarship and writing about it can make a little bit of difference here and there. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, I was curious about the impact of having a border and that border economy on the women who are doing this and their families. So can you trace that sort of opportunity gradient in terms of more infant mortality or education for children or any other metrics like that?
Yeah, I think that's research that needs to be done. So one thing I'll say about the women, so at the time, so in general in Africa, there's this predominance of women in small scale cross-border trade. Part of the reason for the predominance of women at this time when I was doing this research is because during the security clampdowns, men who were coming to the border were more heavily scrutinized because there's this assumption that they're terrorists or illegal migrants. So like, you would see men like regularly get questioned and just arrested at border checkpoints, whereas women were questioned, patted down, but like there's not an assumption that they're terrorists or migrants, they're mamas, whatever, like going on with their trade. But yeah, I mean, I think it does result in a lot of like, because people are so dependent on that, I would assume just from what I see that there's a lot of absence of the mothers from houses. Extended families step in, so there's a lot of care by older siblings, by aunts, by grandparents, and these sorts of things, which is kind of typical for the culture that people are often raised by these extended families, and it's pretty typical of the culture that the women are working too. So which is interesting because a lot of Muslim countries have the kind of stereotype or the generalization or our idea is that like the women are the ones who are kind of prevented from working and so on. But like in Somali culture, for a long time, the women have often been breadwinners. The cross-border smuggling is a very risky business because they can lose everything. But I also consistently heard that like those who do it well, they make a decent income. In fact, you could make as much money from cross-border smuggling as like a master's degree holder would make through their salary in the regional government, because the salary hadn't been adjusted in like 12 years for inflation and these sorts of things. So people were doing decent, but yeah, I think there's a lot more research that's needed on that. And just on that kind of, I mean, infant mortality is pretty high in Somalia region of Ethiopia generally, like health services are really poor. Education is pretty pits. So yeah, there's probably more that needs to be controlled for to understand the impact of the cross-border economy on that. Yeah. Christine?
So I was actually gonna ask about gender dynamics as well, yeah. But let's see, I'll, maybe approach this from a slightly different perspective, but you a lot of what you said pointed to the significance of social capital, the connections, between people within communities. And so I'm curious what you observed about the social dynamics, social interactions, the more interpersonal relationships. If you talk about this or think through this in the book, and how perhaps gender comes into play there.
Yeah, so I do talk about this in the book for a couple of reasons. One, like the most basic, as I'm collecting information in this context, I'm a male foreigner and I am only able to talk to people one-on-one. So mostly I'm not able to access like individual women. And this is important too, and I did talk about this in the book, because the people who are the speculators, women are there too. So the government is also providing contracts and building up, like there are multiple female millionaires in Jigjigga who are just well known. Like some of them have come from starting street trade, got to export business, made a ton of money. They have their own business centers. One has like one of the wealthiest people in Ethiopia is a woman from Jigjigga. And she like has a private plane and all these sorts of things. So yeah, they're there. It was really hard for me to access them other than just in a very generic environment with other people around where they're not going to talk to me about anything in depth. We just kind of like exchange niceties or whatever and then go back. So yeah, I do discuss that in the book. And there was this kind of behind the scenes, which probably needs more unpacking, like politics of marriage going on too, because like the wealthy politicians would try to like, they were often investing through like in-law connections and these sorts of things. So they kind of strategically like tried to find a sister-in-law who was like from a different clan group or something like that, and like give her opportunities to make those people, like her people, kind of happy and whatever. So yeah, there was a big politics behind it. But I do talk about that in the book. Especially like the main space where I talked to women and got kind of most of their input about the trade was on these buses and minibuses, where the women who were smuggling stuff would always just, they were like the ones who were open and would talk to me about everything. Oh, this economy is terrible. The government's controlling everything. All we have left is contraband. Like, I got to leave my kids behind, come to the border every day. Like, and then people would be like, oh, but but I can make a living doing it. And so we had these kind of conversations a lot. And then, yeah, I mean, I interviewed some people, like some of my closer contacts, moms or sisters who I was able to get contact with. And I also hired a research assistant to do some interviews with women business people too, which was awesome, but I couldn't quite get into the kind of depth of questions and the way I would have done the interview. So yeah, it was definitely a challenge. But yeah, it is an interesting context because you have these prominent women in town and like everybody knows who they are. And part of the reason why the government would really invest in those people too, or the perception was like they're not threats to the government because like a woman is not going to be elected or appointed as regional president. So like you can make them into millionaires and like they'll just stay as business people. They're not going to threaten the political scene. Yeah.
I just wanted to make a comment about the gender dynamic that you're talking about, not from Ethiopia's perspective or Somaliland, but as in Nigeria, and I was reading the book and what Dr. Thompson taught, I see a lot of similarities between Nigerian border culture and the Somaliland Ethiopia's border culture. So I wanted to say that there are lots of women involved in smuggling, even in Nigeria. And there's another dimension to it. I have a colleague, a former colleague, whose side hustle, he works for the government, for a government agency, but his side hustle is importing cars from the US to Nigeria. Now, he doesn't import through Nigerian border, he imports through Benin, the neighboring country, because Nigeria has this high import duty because they're trying to do made in Nigeria. They're trying to focus on made in Nigeria product. So they limit cars importation, they limit goods and services coming into Nigeria. They're trying to institute this homegrown food. You know, we're eating what we grow ourselves, but it's not working because Nigeria is heavily dependent on importing goods, and a lot of people prefer import goods to locally made goods. So now, because the import rate is very high in Nigeria, a lot of people will go through Benin, we call it Benin Republic in French in Nigeria. So they go through Cotonou to bring in goods. So the border between Nigeria and Benin, Sene border, is crazy, a very crazy place. And people who smuggle, they are called firewall. Firewall in Yoruba means you have to crawl your chest, because when border patrols and the custom people start shooting, there's usually a shootout between the government side and people smuggling. So it becomes a very dangerous terrain. And so one day, my colleague asked if I was willing to follow him to Cotonou, because he has some cars coming in that they're going to bring into Nigeria. And I was like, yeah, I was really up for it. But then he said I had to dress like a married woman. Because so there's a dynamics between married women, they are more credible, they are business women. Then single women, if I'm dressed the way I'm dressed, there's this perception, this thought that I'll be going cross-border to be involved in prostitution. So there's a limit on the way single women cross the border on land compared to how married women cross the border. And the fact that married women are the ones who sell most of these products that are being smuggled in. Women are the ones who sell it in Nigeria. But also, that's the comment about the gender dynamics that I've said in Nigeria. But I also have a question about the drivers of these minibuses and the taxis. So in Nigeria, the drivers, while we don't normally see the cars in major cities, but when you see them, you recognize them because they are raised. These cars the suspensions are raised, and the tires are huge in a way to accommodate a lot of smuggled goods. So if the cars are empty, it's so high. You're like, why is this car so high at the back? So the front of the car is low, but then the back of the car is raised so high that you know that this is a car used for smuggling. So it's to deceive the border patrol. So they load a lot of things, a lot of goods in those cars, and it looks like a regular car when it's crossing the border. But as soon as they offload those goods, the car, so it's so high. So I'm wondering if you interviewed the buses, you talked about mini buses and buses that crosses the border. If you interviewed the bus drivers, what are their own perception? Because these are major players in this cross-border, in the border industry, in border economy. Did you interview them? Do they have a different a perspective or an opinion about what's going on?
Yeah, so I didn't get to interview the bus drivers, although I sat and talked to a few of them, like in various contexts around Jigjiga. And at the time, so now the smuggling economy is much more like that, where people will pack up a whole car full. And in fact, I was sitting with my friend last month in Addis Ababa before I came back to the US, and he was like, yeah, I started doing contraband in 2018. And he's like, less than 1% of my goods have ever been caught. He was like, it's just like, it's totally open now. And he's like, but we don't, they used to have to do it. So at the time that this book is mainly about, it was mostly like people on minibuses carrying him. So the drivers didn't necessarily play a huge role because the people who were on the buses were taking most of the risk, because the drivers would often sort of not not permit other things to go on the bus because they knew they would get in trouble. But I know there were other cars going around. At the time, people weren't usually willing to talk to me. But you could hear about it from the business people. So for example, one time I was interviewing this guy, he was selling electronics, and I was like, okay, so where do you buy most of the things that are in your shop? And he's like, oh, I get them from Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia, and we just go up there and bring them down by truck. And as he's talking to me, a bus pulls up outside and they start unloading boxes from underneath the bus and stacking them inside his shop. And he just starts laughing like, yeah, okay, I lied. So yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a lot more. I mean, the fact was that especially in this area, and as a PhD student, there no real ethnographic research had been done on trade in this area because it had been such a no-go zone and because of the authoritarian government. So I think there's a lot more, and it still has, as I said, I think it's safe now, but it has this bad perception around it. But there's a lot more research that needs to be done, and the culture of border trade across Africa is so fascinating because partly too because it's a continent that has been divided up by all of these borders, and there's so many landlocked countries, and so many countries are dependent on imports, and that sometimes have to cross multiple borders to get there. So yeah, there's a lot of really fascinating things going on.
I just wanted to briefly interrupt and say thank you so much. I do want to do the raffle if you don't mind. Awesome. Let's give Dr. Thompson another round of